You are listening to That You May Grow, a podcast brought to you by the Mount Vernon Church of Christ in Mount Vernon, Texas. I am one of the ministers here at the Mount Vernon Church of Christ, as well as one of the hosts for this podcast. My name is Preston McEllier, and with me here in the studio is my brother Jared Hammond.
Yes, sir. Glad to be here with you again, Preston, and looking forward to another opportunity to look at some of these names of the Bible and see what kind of lessons we can learn. There's always so much more material and more things that could be said than we originally think coming into these, but definitely so many valuable lessons.
Yeah, every time we think, all right, we'll see if we can get an entire episode out of this, and then next thing you know, we do what I guess most preachers do and talk way too much.
We have a habit of that, right? Long-winded?
Yeah, just a little bit. And
it happens.
You know, if we had left everything in that we ended up messing up right before we started this podcast of just not realizing that we were starting it and then saying good morning whenever you might not be listening to this in the morning and everything else, that hopefully is not a sign for how this episode is about to go.
Hopefully not.
Well, today we are continuing along, as Jared mentioned, looking at some different individuals in the Bible, and we're actually right in the same, time frame, same chapter, same context as the last two individuals we looked at. And today we will be looking at Lot.
And even looking like you're talking about here with Lot, the chapters we're going to be covering, typically when you come to these, your primary focus is on Abraham, right? Because that's where the main emphasis is. But there's still a lot that can be learned, a lot about Lot. There you go. There's a lot that can be learned about Lot. So looking forward to this one just as much as any other, and seeing what kind of application we can take from Lot and the things that we can learn from him.
And we are actually introduced to Lot the same time we're introduced to Abraham and Sarah right at the very end of Genesis chapter 11. And in Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, we learn that Lot is actually Abraham's nephew.
He is, and, we see that his father had died in verse 28 there, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. So his father has actually died, and now it seems as if he's now housing with or staying there close with Abraham, as we'll see them make a journey together.
And we don't really know exactly how old Lot would be at this point. Maybe the assumption, because of how he seems so willing to, follow Abraham, even out of Haran here in a moment, to go to the land of Canaan. It seems like maybe Lot is younger, and so maybe that's why he goes along with Abraham and goes with him so he can kind of continue to be raised by him. But there's really no indication one way or the other. We know at least by the time we reach Genesis 13, Lot is a grown man, or at least old enough to make his own decisions at that point.
Yeah, and even have great possessions by that point, and we'll get into that more. But, like you say, there's nothing that really specifies an exact age range here. It does seem as if, he has some sort of willingness, like you say, to follow Abraham, whether, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but, when Abram receives the promise of God, it was likely that he might have discussed that with Lot, and maybe that was part of, Lot's deciding to follow along with him. But regardless, it's kind of all speculation. All that the text says that it reveals to us is that when Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken, that's in chapter 12 and verse 4, it says, and Lot went with him. So he made that journey with him. We don't know exactly, what was the motivational factor, but regardless, he went.
Yeah, he went, and then we don't say anything else about Lot through the rest of chapter 12. We know he was there as they would go down to Egypt, and everything that transpired between Abraham and Sarah and the Pharaoh at that time. And it's not until we come to Genesis chapter 13, however, that we actually see something specific about Lot again.
Yeah, and it's quite a situation. Kind of as we talked about earlier, he has a lot of possessions, and he has his own herdsmen. And apparently they both have quite the plethora of herdsmen or livestock and all of this combined. And it comes to a point, as it says there in Genesis chapter 13, in verse 6, it says, "Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot." The situation that arose, it wasn't something that was specific as, it's Abram and Lot having the problem here, but it's the herdsmen. But ultimately, who winds up working out the problem?
It ultimately ends up that Abram recognizes this issue, but it's something that has to be resolved between Abram and Lot. You look in Genesis 13 and verse 8, Abram says to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren." And so from that point on, it goes on where Abram basically says, you look around, and if you pick the land over here to the right, I'll go left. If you choose the land to our left, I'll go right. And so what we see in this situation, even if it is Abram kind of initiating it, Lot follows suit in order to show us that we need to be willing to seek to resolve our conflicts.
They could have easily got so caught up in this conflict that was there between the herdsmen that it could have caused great problems between them. But, both of them had the mindset, look, we're brethren. We don't want to have these kind of contentions between us, but rather let's find a resolve. And that's what they do. And, this is one of those moments where you look at Lot taking the opportunity to say, okay, well, Abram gives him the choice. You choose what you want. You go the direction you want, I'll go the other direction. Now, sometimes, maybe it is the case, we come to this text and we think, okay, well, Lot was being a little bit selfish here. And maybe that is the case. It's hard to say. He looked in the direction and he saw what was going to be good for his livestock, where he could, likely prosper, where things would be great for him. And he decided, you know what, here's the direction I'm going.
Right. And with it, we look at what Lot could have done, right? Lot very well could have said, "No, Uncle Abram, I want you to pick where to go." It's a possibility he could have done that. Another thing Lot could have done is just to say, "I'm not leaving you. I lost my daddy back home, and I've come with you and Sarah. I know God is going to bless you based on the promise he gave you, and I want to be part of that. I don't want to separate from you." But Lot realized, no, the best thing to do is to resolve this conflict, meaning that it's time for us to split up. And whether or not the selfishness is involved in it, we can speculate. What we do know based on what we see there in Genesis 13 is that Lot seems to make the decision based on his own wisdom and his own judgment. And then by the time we reach everything that's going on by the end of the chapter, we see that Abram, his approach is a little bit different. Abram's focus is on the Lord God, and Abram seems to be praying to God through this. And, of course, God blesses him as a result of these things. And, of course, going back to chapter 12 with the initial promise that takes place. So perhaps it is some selfishness involved, but either way, we see Lot kind of using his own judgment and what he sees, what he thinks is going to be best, of course, for himself and his herd and everything else.
Going back to kind of how you started that particular thought, how much differently would things have been if he would have said, you know what, yes, Abram, you are much older, you're wiser, maybe you should make the decision, right, and I'll follow your lead. Like, you decide where you want to go. Maybe that would have made things a whole lot better in the long run, but he took his choice. He looked toward the green plains. He looked where there was water everywhere. And even there in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 10, it gives this reference like the garden of the Lord. I mean, it was a beautiful land. It had everything that they needed, and he made his choice. Now, at a distance, this seemed like a great thing. This seemed really good. It seemed very promising. One of the things that kind of stands out is, when he decided, okay, this is where I am going to go, it says he pitched his tent. Well, I guess in the New King James it says even as far as Sodom. And I don't remember which translation I was looking at earlier, but there was a reference to he pitched his tent toward Sodom as if it indicated he pitched his tent in that direction and then slowly moved closer. But I guess reading in the New King James, it says even as far as Sodom, so it was a direct move straight to Sodom initially.
And I think, though, there's still something in that it's the King James that says that he did that towards Sodom. Not exactly sure because we don't know exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were,
right.
How far of a distance this may have been. But whether it was the case that he went directly to Sodom or he gradually worked his way towards Sodom, initially, Lot doesn't know from the initial distance when he looks out what lies inside. All he sees is the green grass, but sometimes if we have much like life experience at all, we recognize the green grass is not always the best grass.
Right.
Sometimes there are more problems that come along with it. And so whatever the case was, again, if he goes straight to Sodom or if he slowly works there, the closer he approached the city, the longer he was near the city, he very well should have been able to recognize the problems that were there.
There in verse 13, it says, "But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord." As he is approaching, like you're talking about, the closer he got and just the little time spent there, he should have been able to recognize the wickedness of that city. Doesn't seem to indicate, that it changed his thought about the place. He still went in that direction, and that's where he wound up staying. But, there's a lot of things that we might approach in this life where, like you're talking about, it may look really good from a distance. But, would we have the willingness, the closer we approach, if we start recognizing that, okay, this is really not all that good for me, not all that good for my family, would we have the mindset, maybe this isn't what's best, and we need to turn away from this?
Yeah, it's a good lesson for us to realize that everything's not as it seems. It's easy for us, maybe, I don't know if saying to be critical is the right word, but it's easier for us to look and to kind of pick apart every move that Lot is making right here, because we know how the story ends. At the time Lot's making the decisions, he doesn't know. Again, you look from the distance, Lot doesn't know the wickedness that lies inside the city, but as we're saying, the closer he drew, more time he spends, he should have known. It's interesting to me that the very next chapter here in Genesis 14, we find this war kind of taking place, and right there in the midst of it all, Sodom and Gomorrah, and suddenly now Lot is taken captive as a prisoner of war. And Lot probably did not see that coming when he was back with his uncle Abram, looking out over the land, surveying the land to decide where he would go. If we knew everything that was going to happen with every little choice that we make in this life, it would probably we'd probably make some real changes in our decisions. But what we can learn looking at this kind of from a bird's eye view, we see from this example of Lot and from all that's taking place here in Genesis 13 and even onward in the text, that again, everything's not going to be as it seems.
No, and we talked a little bit about Abraham and his desire to come in and help, Lot and all those who were captured. But no, this, I don't think it ever would have been in his wildest dreams, right? To wind up in this situation. But Abraham comes and he rescues them, and everybody's delivered back. Things seem like, okay, well, things are good again, or as good as they were going to be. But we know, like you say, more about Sodom as we, survey the whole of the narrative, and we understand the wickedness of that city. One of those moments, should he have really, begin to think about things or see things a little more clearly at that point? It seems as if he has chosen this location thinking about, hey, this is great for my cattle. This is great for my livestock, whatever livestock he had. That'll be really good for that, but how great is this for my family? How good is this location for those that I love the most? Whether or not those things are on his mind's hard to say. We run into those situations plenty. ourselves, and likely we found ourselves in situations where we probably should have done differently. Hindsight's 20/20. Looking back, there are changes or things we might have done differently. This is one of those moments for him.
Well, and one of the things that we talked about, Jared, and kind of our preparation for this episode is just to how many times we kind of stop and think with Lot, how did he allow himself to get into these situations? But then if we're honest and stop and look at our own lives and some of the situations we've put ourselves or our families in, we're a lot like Lot. That sometimes we don't always see it for what it is, and we can be kind of so blinded by, the beautiful green grass and how good it's going to be for our livestock or for our business or whatever it might be, but we don't always stop to think, like you mentioned, about how this might affect myself, my family, what it's going to do for us spiritually.
Yeah, and, it may sound as if we're somewhat just kind of beating on Lot here.
And we'll get to the positive at the end.
Because it's just one of those when you sit back, it's like, man, what were you thinking? But at the same time, even in the midst of all of this, it kind of takes a jump there from chapter 13 in Genesis then to chapter 19 in Genesis before we see another significant moment with Lot. But at this point, all of a sudden you see this situation that takes place where these men come to Sodom. It says there in chapter 19 and verse 1, now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. And the first thing that we're going to see is that Lot immediately shows care and concern, hospitality, and he wants to be helpful to these people. So regardless, even the fact, he's within this great wicked area, incredibly wicked and all this sin taking place, regardless of all of that, he seems to still have, good morals about him. Now there's going to be some questionable actions here in a moment, but he does show some good character, even though he's been kind of right in the midst of all of this wickedness.
And even adding to that with, of course, the kindness and the hospitality, the concern he shows towards these two angels that come to Sodom. And, of course, by the time we reach the middle of the chapter, these angels referred to as men. We could sit here and decide, okay, are these spiritual beings? Are these simply human messengers? Whatever the case is, these angels, these men, they come. Lot shows kindness, but where was he sitting when they came?
Sitting at the gate.
And if I understand what it means for someone to be sitting at the gate, kind of in that position where Lot was, that was a position not given to just anybody, but it was a more prominent position. It was one that really only those who were well-respected would hold.
And that's something you really see throughout Scripture in the Old Testament. You could go all the way, to the book of Esther, right? There's those mentions of being there at the gate, and it typically carries with it that idea of this, not just everybody was going to be there, but more of this position of prominence. But, here he is at the gate. He sees the angels coming. They have the idea that they're going to stay, it's evening time, so it's approaching, nightfall. And they're saying they're going to stay out in the open square. Well, here's something interesting is that immediately Lot's like, wait a minute, no, that's a terrible idea. That you don't want to do that, right? He knows his neighbors. He knows the people that are there in Sodom. And he is immediately trying to reason with them and change their mind about what they're doing because he knows what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. He knows how wicked the people are. Again, you kind of have to stop and say, man, if you understand that they're that wicked that a man cannot pass through and stay, in the open square without likely being assaulted or sexually abused or whatever, why are you still there?
And that question continues because as we keep moving through Genesis 19, and by the time we reach verses 6 through 8, Lot does something that is pretty unthinkable. Lot, because these men from the city have come to the door and they're practically trying to beat his door down in order to get to the two men so that they may know them, Lot instead says, leave them be. I've got two daughters here. And, of course, you look at it and everything that goes on. He says, in fact, in verse 8, I have two daughters who have not known a man, let me bring them out to you and do to them as you will.
Yeah, that's it's hard to know what to say on that one. I couldn't imagine. I don't know if it's his mindset that, okay, what these men are wanting to do to his company, if that's a greater wickedness, because it would be these men doing this, sexual things with other men, that he decides, it would be better if they did this to my daughters. I don't know what his thinking is here.
And maybe the case is, again, Lot knows who he's dealing with in the city. Maybe Lot knew that offering them his daughters really wouldn't mean anything because the men wouldn't be interested in them. Maybe so, but still, he offers up his daughters.
Such a strange moment.
And so even in this, I think, Jared, we can find another valuable lesson, one that even is kind of echoed in the New Testament in a different context. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good morals or good habits, depending on the translation. But the principle applies even here in Genesis 19, I believe, because we can see maybe how it is that the time Lot spent in the wicked city maybe was still continuing to affect and cloud some of his judgment calls. That, yeah, good thing for him to try to do to save the men, bring them in, show the hospitality, but still to be willing to offer up two of his daughters, it's just hard to fathom.
It is. And, was there something that he recognized that was different about, were these angels? Were they just men, like you were talking about earlier? Did he recognize that there was something different about these two men or angels that would push him to the point of trying to provide that kind of protection, even to offer up his daughters? Hard to say. Some of the details we don't have there. We do recognize that, after part of this struggle goes on, that the angels, these men, they struck the men that were outside the door with blindness. So a miraculous thing took place here. Whether or not he knew that there was something different about it, I don't know. I still can't, as a father and having a daughter, I still cannot reason with that myself, to say that this would be the better option. I don't know. It's one of those situations in Scripture. It's difficult to understand, and I think culturally, things I know were a lot different then, but, to what extent does that play in? It's just a challenging section of the text.
Right, and one thing that is abundantly clear, though, as we continue looking through Genesis 19, is that sin has an effect on us individually, but it also has an effect on our family. As we're already seeing perhaps some of the effect it can have on us individually. You look at Lot, some of those decisions he's making. There might be some times in our own life where, depending on the situation, we might do some things that normally we wouldn't do. People talk about situational ethics, and that'd be something maybe for us to discuss way on down the road, whether or not it's ever the right thing to do the wrong thing. And biblically speaking, I don't believe we find that to be the case, that it's ever the right thing to do the wrong thing. But what we find, though, again, is Lot is offering up his daughters, but as it continues, we are going to find verse 16, that Lot is lingering behind in the city, even after he knows the destruction that's going to come. But Jared, we also see in this as well that sin has an effect on our family.
You think about some of the things that have been said about this location, Sodom. Back in chapter 18 and verse 20, and to kind of lead into what you're talking about there, in chapter 18 and verse 20, it says, "And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave." Here's the reason why that kind of judgment's coming, right? This is a very wicked city, and this outcry is being heard by the Lord, and now something's fixing to take place. There's justice going to come, right? Well, you go further into chapter 19, in verse 13, the men, the angels that were speaking to Lot, verse 13, it says, "For we will destroy this place, because the outcry against them has grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." This is something that it wasn't like a foreign concept. I don't guess I should say a foreign concept. It wasn't something that wasn't known, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is something that people passing through, it seems as if they understood this to be a wicked place. Lot has his family there. It shouldn't be all that much of a surprise that it's going to begin to have a negative impact on his family if you stay in that location.
But
right?
how often is it, though, that we find ourselves in very similar situations? May not be the specific issues that were taking place in Sodom, and may not be to that level of wickedness, but how often might we find ourselves where we continue to put ourselves or our family in certain situations, and then suddenly we wake up one day and now maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a child, maybe it's a sibling, whoever the connection might be, they're suddenly no longer faithful to the Lord because now this particular sport, this particular job, this particular friend group now kind of has a greater appeal in their life or a greater priority in their life than what matters the most.
There's a proverb, I think it's in Proverbs 6, I believe. It says, "Can a man hold fire to his bosom and his garment not be burned?" You get close to fire, you're going to get burned. And thinking of very practical ways where we can see this even in our lives today, if we expect our children to grow and to be God-fearing, to have a strong relationship with the Lord, and to, try and remove themselves from evil, we cannot lead them there ourselves, right? If we don't try and remove ourselves from those kinds of situations, we can't expect them to do the same. It could be something as simple as, think about the things that you might watch on TV. If you say, okay, well, this is fine, we're going to go watch this R-rated movie, and you reason with yourself and say, okay, well, it only has, 6 cuss words, and it only uses the Lord's name in vain twice. It's not any nudity in it, but it has these things. And you start trying to, reason about it and say, well, it's not that bad. Well, you allow these little things like that and allow those to continue to build. It's going to start having an effect.
Well, it doesn't affect me. I don't have any issue with it, but what about my child who might be in the other room who can hear it?
Mm-hmm.
What about my wife who might be sitting there to spend time with me, but now she's having to watch this as well? We don't always know. And it might be the case, okay, we ask, well, is this going to be a problem with you? And they might tell us, well, no, it'll be okay, but we've got to be careful. That proverb you mentioned is actually Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 27, and there's so much truth to that. How close can you get to the line without falling over the line? And maybe it's kind of silly to think about, but for me, I have awful balance, and I think about if I'm trying to continually edge up to this line, and there's a drop on the other side of it, that, I just want to get as close as I can to the edge. I'm not going to go over, but I'm just going to get right there at the edge. I know for myself with my balance, I'm going to fall. But I think if we're all honest and you come to a point and you think about something like the Grand Canyon, you might even think about something at a smaller scale. You could think about one of those little concrete blocks on the edge of a parking space, and you stand at the top of it, and you see how far out can you go kind of over the edge before the drop, before suddenly anybody's going to lose their balance and fall down. Well, what's the best way to make sure you don't fall? You don't go to the edge in the first place.
That's right. I was just sitting here thinking about another way of kind of describing this, but you go into a restaurant and say it's a restaurant that has a bar. You're not going to take your kids over to the bar to sit down and eat their dinner, right, at the bar where the alcohol is served. Anybody would think, that wants to keep their children away from that would think it'd be terribly foolish to choose, okay, let's go sit at the bar. You wouldn't do that, regardless if you didn't plan on drinking or anything, which you shouldn't, but you wouldn't sit at that location. You wouldn't try and tiptoe the line, if you will. You'd be far from that, and it's like in this situation, it's like, man, he's tiptoeing all over the line. And
when we look, again, in Genesis 19, we see the effect that this location has on his family. Genesis 19:15, Lot goes to his sons-in-laws, And he says to them, the instruction he received that destruction is coming. And what do his sons-in-laws do?
They laugh. They think he is joking or something of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, they don't. They're like, "Are you kidding me right now? Are you really telling me this is about to happen?" And so they laugh at him. They joke at him. I think I had the wrong verse down for that. I said Genesis 19:15. That's going to actually be
a little bit before that.
Let's see. That's going to be verse 14.
Yeah.
And so his sons-in-law thought actually that he is joking about this. Well, verse 15, then the next morning comes, and now the angels are urging Lot to hurry. Tell him, get your family, your wife, your 2 daughters, get those who are here, get out of the city lest you get caught up. And then verse 16, sometimes we focus on the fact that Lot lingered, but who else was lingering with him?
Ultimately, his wife, his daughters, all, that were about to flee. But the angels, these men or angels, would be the ones that would take them by the hand and, kind of give them this, let's go, like, no more time. We're not playing around. Get out of here. And they finally, they finally do leave from there. It's kind of interesting when they give the instruction. They tell them in verse 17, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. I don't exactly know what Lot had in mind in verse 19 when he's responding to them in that instruction. And he says, but I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. When they told him to go to the mountains, to run for the mountains, his first thought was, there's evil in the mountains. Now, living in Sodom, there was great evil and great wickedness. I don't know exactly what it was about the mountains that he seemed to fear so much, but he began to reason with these men and saying, okay, well, what if we go to this other small city? What if we go there rather than going to the mountains? And basically, verse 20, that's kind of what he's doing. He's reasoning with them, and he's trying to get them to allow him to go to a different location. Verse 22, it says, hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zor. For whatever reason, he was more fearful of the mountains than he was of the wickedness of Sodom. And he chooses, okay, well, what if we go to this other small city? What if we go there instead? So that's where they go. And
it's not until after the destruction has taken place, and it tells us in verse, again, after the destruction has taken place,
verse 30.
Verse 30, Lot would then go on up to the mountains as he originally was instructed to do. But I think as well about how in getting to this point, there's obviously still some sort of hesitation in Lot about it just initially going on to the mountains. But we see as well how much he's been through. He's just lost, whatever he'd built up for himself in the city. Part of his family thinks that he's a joke, essentially. His sons-in-law think he's joking. They can't believe he would believe this, whatever it might be. In the process of going out of the city, they're told not to look back as the Lord is raining down destruction on the city, but who looks back?
His wife.
So now he loses his wife, and of course we're about to see, even continuing on in Genesis 19, that although we may not have seen an effect on his daughters yet, we're about to see the effect on his daughters.
Absolutely. And, the lingering, I was just thinking about some of the verses we had kind of went through there. It's not that it was just for a moment, and there at verse 14, where it talks about his sons-in-laws, it seemed as if he was joking to them, so they just kind of laughed it off. And who knows, maybe Abraham was somewhat dumbfounded, like, wait, no, or not Abraham, but Lot was somewhat dumbfounded, and he's like, no, seriously, right, this is what's going to happen, and they think he's joking, and maybe he's a little bit, caught up in the moment, like, okay, what do I do now? Well, verse 15, when the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry. if I'm reading that right, a whole night has passed, and they're still lingering, right? They still haven't took the initiative to go, and finally they take their hands and they say, look, go now. And they rush them out of there. And, of course, like you say, his wife looks back. She winds up being turned to a pillar of salt. Him and his 2 daughters. Now, remember, he had sons-in-laws in the city, plural, if I'm not mistaken. Therefore, he had at least 2 more daughters in the city as well. Now, the wife that he's lost also, and now it's just him and these other 2 daughters that have fled for that small city. Like you stated there in verse 30, it does say that Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains. But it also says right after that, it says, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. So whatever had transpired, whether it was, okay, looking back after everything and just seeing the smoke coming from where, we know he didn't look back while he was fleeing, but.
Yeah, verse 28, after the fact, he had gone out. Well, or actually, verse 27, it's Abraham who goes out and then sees everything that's taken place, and the fact that the whole area there was filled with smoke, and the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Lot may not have turned around to see it, but I'm almost certain that Lot was probably smelling it. Who knows what direction the wind may have been blowing and how that might have affected all the smoke. Is it, going out ahead of Lot? Is this smoke just billowing up to the point that the entire sky is now darkened? Whatever the case is, Lot knew what had happened behind him without having to turn around and look at it.
Yeah, now within that little city of Zoar, the small city he said, let me flee to, it's like, okay, wait a minute. They told me not to look back. They told me to escape to the mountains. Now maybe he's realizing, okay, we're talking about serious business here. This is no playing around. Maybe it's at that point he has a change of heart because he does go to the mountains. No longer has the fear that he had of being in the mountains, but rather his fears of being in that city out in the plains. So he departs, him and his 2 daughters. Now, like you were talking about earlier, we haven't seen just a whole lot about how, the city might have changed their morals other than what we saw with Lot and offering up his daughters, but we're fixing to see it with his 2 daughters and their plan that they, work up, to do to their father.
Right. Verse 31, we find with these 2 daughters, with the firstborn says to the younger, our father is old, there is no man on the earth to come in to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Now, for these daughters, their entire world has just been turned upside down. I mean, what they knew in Sodom and Gomorrah, no more. All their friends are gone. Family is now gone. And to them, they're sitting here thinking, what do we do? What do we do? Dad has nobody to carry on the family name. We've not borne any children. And they knew that this is something, well, they thought this is something they needed to do. But they also show in their decision-making process that they knew their father in his right mind would not go along with it.
It's definitely the way they went about it. They had reason within their own minds and justified what they were fixing to do within their own minds, thinking they were doing it for the better good. But if it truly was for the better good, would they had to have made him drunk, right, to the point that he didn't even realize when they had came in or when they had left, is what the text says. Would they have had to gone to that extent if this truly would have been right? And the answer, of course, is no. For whatever reason, this was their plan of action when they saw that their father would have no one, to carry on his name, and another such a strange situation. Is it possible that the things that they were exposed to in Sodom might have led to this type of thinking? It's a question we can ask. I don't know if we can definitely say yes, but it sure seems like it's a possibility,
I mean, there are times that we might find in our own lives where sometimes perhaps children might make a decision that we ourselves would not have made. But sometimes we may not always know what led them to that decision. Perhaps it is because of the decisions we have made that have put our children into certain situations that have affected their thinking to the point that to them, they made the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not it's right or wrong, we've got to always remember, especially as fathers, as husbands, as leaders of the home, those who might be making decisions, that the decisions we make have an impact on others.
Just as much as the location, the environment could have affected their judgment and their moral compass, if you will. It could have likely been even Lot and his willingness to offer them up, right? When those two men or angels came through, whatever this reflects is definitely, what we would look at today and say, well, that's just terribly wrong. Now, things were somewhat different then. Abram was married to his half-sister, but still, this is something that's always been looked at as wrong, no matter how you slice it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they have come to, and two nations that will be seen much more as you work through Scripture. The Ammonites and the Moabites are who are going to come from this, situation.
And now, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, that pretty well closes the book on Lot. If this is all we know about Lot, we're, I guess, kind of doing like what we're doing right now. A lot of, that's an interesting choice.
Mm-hmm.
How could you have put yourself in the situation? Why didn't you get out of it earlier? But we do the same thing still today. But we also know by the New Testament, we learn another interesting detail about Lot. And earlier I said, we'd get to the positive. Being honest, I mean, we're, 41 minutes in now, and this has been pretty heavy with a lot of negative. But we want to at least try to end it with the positive that we do find on Lot. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7 tells us that Lot was righteous. It says, and actually calls him righteous Lot. Now, the focus of 2 Peter 2 and verse 7 is not to say, Lot is a righteous man. That's an important detail to gain from that. But Jared, the focus and the emphasis there in that context of 2 Peter 2, and the reason for bringing up Lot is to show us, if I'm not mistaken, that God is able to deliver the godly from temptation, from that evil.
Yeah, I mean, you could even take that same thought and that verse all the way back to Genesis there in Genesis chapter 19, where it says, "And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt." That was God's assistance in that and help delivering him from that situation, from that location.
Mm-hmm.
So there was still enough about Lot that God saw him fit or deserving of that assistance.
And we talked about as well from Genesis 19:15, that thought there that Lot and his family stayed another night in the city knowing what's about to come. And then verse 16, that Lot and his family linger, and it requires the two angels, those two men, to, pull them all out of the city, take them by the hand, lead them out. Well, there's another detail in the middle of Genesis 19 and verse 16 that says the reason this took place is because the Lord is being merciful to him. Mm-hmm. He remembers Abram. He remembers Lot. He sends Lot out of the city. He's merciful to Lot. When Lot tries to stick around another day, he brings him out. But I think about another important verse for us as Christians today out of 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. It's not the case that God is going to send these angels to take us by the hand, pull us out of the city. But God is still merciful to us. God is still faithful to us, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. And he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able, but with the temptation will make a way of escape that we may be able to bear it. Now, sin is going to have an effect on us. We don't need to be testing God and putting ourselves in all of these situations to make ourselves be tempted. But maybe the case is we find ourselves where, maybe like Lot, we're surrounded by wickedness, as Peter would say there in 2 Peter 2. The fact is that our souls are wearied, being tormented by the wickedness day by day, and we think, is there even a way out? God's going to deliver the way out. It may not always be what we would want for it to be, but there's going to be a way out.
Absolutely, and being able to step back and really see our situation clearly, and being willing to recognize, okay, yeah, maybe that was a poor decision, but now I can make a better decision, right? Find yourself in a situation like you're talking about where temptation is there. God is going to provide an out as long as we're opening our eyes to seeing it. We have to, be mindful and be looking for that out, and it'll be there. But, thinking about, especially with fathers, with husbands, and really, any adult, they need to be striving to lead our families in a direction that is not only going to benefit them or prosper them physically, right? That's where this all started and all these problems. He looked toward the green grass. He looked toward everything that these plains had to offer. Physically speaking, it was amazing. It was like the garden of the Lord. We need to be able to see past that and really look to the spiritual and make sure that the decisions that we are making are for the spiritual reasons over the physical reasons.
One of the biggest points of application we've been making through this is how our decisions affect others. More than that, how sin, how evil, how wickedness has an impact on us and our families. But the same is true for good. If we're able to do what is best spiritually speaking, and we're able to help raise our children up in that, we're able to continually put our family in situations that they might excel spiritually speaking, that's going to rub off. That's going to have an impact just as the wickedness would. And if we stop and think, which would I rather surround my family with? Which would I rather make sure my children are continually around, that my wife is continually around, that she continually hears, continually sees? Would I rather that be all the wickedness that takes place or all the good that God has provided?
In every decision we make in life, from the smallest to the greatest, being able to say, you know what, maybe this is not what's best for everybody else involved. Maybe it'd be great for me, but being able to step back and see how it might affect everybody else, being able to do that, it's a challenge. It's not something that's incredibly easy, not something that's always going to be at the front of our mind when we're thinking about things, especially when it comes, occupation or things of that nature. You may have a great opportunity with a change of work, but it may completely pull you away from your home and being there to help raise your kids and being that good example to them. Or there's a variety of ways we could illustrate that. But just having a mindset of making sure that everything that we do is at least focused on the idea, will this draw me closer to God, or will this push me and my family further away from Him? It should be something that's on our minds.
And it's a hard thing to do, again, to see it down the road of where these things might lead. It's a hard decision to make even whenever you're in the midst of it, of, what do I do? Do I stay here, or is it time to, get up and move, whatever the case might be? Lot had a lot of hard decisions to make.
He did, and he never would have dreamed, I don't think, that going ahead and approaching Sodom would cost him his wife, would cost him a couple of daughters, sons-in-laws, all of those things that it ultimately did cost him. I don't think he could have ever fathomed that one choice would have that great of effect.
And as difficult as it is to stop and think about all that Lot went through, and then to try to stop and think about where I am in my life, decisions I've made, situations I've put myself or my family in, as difficult, as challenging as it is, Jared, aren't you thankful that God is merciful toward us, that God gives us a way out whenever it is that, like you said earlier, when we actually open our eyes and we stop to really consider the situation and what needs to be done? It's a blessing to know how faithful, how merciful, how loving our God is.
It truly is. Our God is an awesome God, and the love that He has shown toward us is something that's truly, it's amazing. And we have this wonderful opportunity to reciprocate that love back toward Him and to grow closer to Him, to know Him better, and to better illuminate the light of Christ in the lives that we live. And that's what, that's what we're here. I mean, that's what we're doing in this podcast. We're trying to grow closer to God. We're trying to help people reason through the text and learn these lessons and apply it, just as we're trying to apply these things to our life. We're hoping that our listeners are doing the same thing.
And we discussed from the outset when we decided to kind of do some of these character studies that we wanted to make sure that we didn't just focus on the good, but we also recognize some of the more difficult things, some of the more unfortunate things that take place to the individuals we find in the Bible. I'm thankful to know that Lot was a righteous man, but just based on what we see out of the account in Genesis, we might not come to that same conclusion.
Not likely.
And I think, maybe there's a reason for that. We recognize if it's there, it's for our benefit. And when we look at all these lessons that we can learn from Lot, we've got a lot of hard lessons that we can learn ourselves, that we come to realize the importance of resolving our conflicts. We realize everything's not going to be as it seems. We find, yes, the importance of showing concern for others, but we quickly find, again, evil company corrupts good habits. It's not going to be as it seems, again, there in the city. And finally, we see the effect that sin will have on us and on our family.
Many beautiful lessons that we can learn from the Scripture and from the life of Lot and his family. We hope that this has been beneficial for you. I know, speaking for myself, and I think I can speak for Preston, it has been a great benefit to us. And we thoroughly enjoy these opportunities and appreciate all those who are listening in. And we've had some feedback, from those that are a lot from this congregation, from our own congregation, and from others. Mm-hmm. So we appreciate that and hope that you continue to listen in. And if you have any thoughts or concerns or, any suggestions even for upcoming podcasts or episodes, we will have an email address there with the information with the podcast, and feel free to send any questions or thoughts our way, and we'll try and get to those in our upcoming podcast.
And Lord willing, next time we are together, we'll be moving right along through the book of Genesis, and we'll be looking next time, Lord willing, at Isaac. And we hope that you will be able to join us then. And in the meantime, our prayer is that you would continue to grow.